Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. It sounds funny to say it that way now because it used to be it was the University of Texas, period, before they had to balance the interests of everybody. Anyway, happy to be joined today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics, who's here again today. You've already heard from him.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that what we're doing here, balancing the interests of everybody?
Always, my friend, always. And we're joined by a returning but still very special guest, co-founder, former executive editor of the Texas Tribune, our friend Ross Ramsey. Ross, thank you for coming to campus.
I went to UTEP for a year, and we do appreciate it.
There you go. See?
Yeah, there you go.
Good feelings.
Right.
It wasn't that they were forced to adopt that. But I like the way that they kept the right? It's who we are.
Yeah, we were just a university at
a University of Texas at El Paso. That's good.
Randos.
So, a lot going on since last week's pod, and I'm going to take a couple minutes and we'll catch up a little bit and then jump into this. As the legislature is attempting to wrap up their second session, their second special session, the when that's going to happen seems a little up in the air. It looks like, word on the street and just looking at the flow of legislation is they're not going to make that Friday deadline before Labor Day. It's just not what it's looking like. The big must-do item, at least the main must-do item is done. Senate passed a congressional redistricting map over the weekend with a, fairly iron-fisted procedural play that undercut plans for a Democratic filibuster at the last moment. If you're listening to this, you probably know about that. I'm sure it'll come up. Move the map out of the Senate amidst just a flurry of bad feelings between partisans and most people involved, I think. Beyond that, House and Senate have been playing this game of eyeballing each other as they pass legislation back and forth and meet and then adjourn for a few hours and then meet again. I think today the House was meeting early, kind of around regular time to do the usual hearing of bills and receive bills. And then they were going to go on break and then come back this afternoon. And then at least as of this morning, and then the Senate was scheduled to go in an hour after the House. We've seen tons of that stuff, right, as everything's unfolded. As we record today, two of the most divisive remaining bills are on the House calendar today. So SB 8, limiting transgender access to certain facilities, to use the language of the bill. A Mays-Middleton joint from the Senate is up for consideration on the House calendar today. And then HB 7 seeks to crack down on access to abortion pills by granting, more rights of civil action. That comes up. We can talk about that more. That's also on the floor today. All of which is a very long wind-up to the discussion we actually want to have and why we're very happy to have Ross here today. I think we have two mixed goals today to kind of catch up a little bit, bring some of the current events into this, but also to ask the big question, and you're really helpful in this, Ross, is, we're getting there's a lot of feeling going around when you talk to people right now in the process in particular that, things have really changed. Yeah. And that there's a real fundamental kind of changes to the, both the institutions, the practice. We'll get to explicitly the norms of politics and governance in Texas. And I want to want to kick around some of the areas where that's happening, see what you guys think in particular. So, we'll start with something we've already queued up. Ross, you think that is the level of hostility that we're seeing new? The level of partisan hostility? There's often people that hated each other.
The level of partisan hostility is new, and the whole thing of you've gone from sort of a culture of let's fight all day and then go have dinner together, or let's go have a drink or something like that.
A drink or 10.
We're colleagues and opponents, and not enemies. And now there's much more of a sense of enemies, and there's a much greater component now of sort of outside pressures on the members. Whether it's social media, whether it's activists, whether whatever it is. I saw you with so-and-so, what's that about? As opposed to,
Right.
We sent you to Austin, you did the things you said you were going to do and you came home, So I think there's less of that. That said, the Capitol is built for fights. It's built for conflict, and it's built, so we can either go in this building and argue, or we can go out in the parking lot and fight with swords. Let's go in the building. So there's always something going on, or often something going on, that has everybody sort of intellectually and emotionally involved, and they get hot about it, and they want their way, and they want their way 100%, and they're mad at anybody who denies it to them, and they have their moments, but they generally come around. And we've been in a period for several years now, largely because, a lot of these fights are cultural fights. We're not just arguing about this business deal or that regulatory deal or something like that.
Right. These are not distributive issues.
Right. And,
Yeah.
It's stuff that, I feel something about, and when you get feelings in there, then you get, hurt feelings in there. And, and then the last thing I would add to it is, we were for a very long time in a position in Texas where Texas was, almost contrary to national trends, where you'd see something going on, nationally, and Texas would go the other way, or Texas sort of had its own take on it. And then there was a period where Texas was one of the main laboratories for legislative ideas. California did a lot of stuff that national people looked at and went, oh, that's interesting. And Texas did a lot of stuff that went the same way. Now it's all top down.
Went the same way in a different direction.
Well, it was a different piece of politics, but it was like, conservative policy comes from the Texas and Florida sector, and liberal policy comes from California, to some extent, Illinois, New York. And now we're in much more of a top-down situation, and Texas is following leads, and we've talked about this before on this podcast and in other places, where something happens in national politics and it ripples down into state and local politics pretty quickly. So you start hearing things from school board candidates that you first heard from congressional candidates. It used to be the other way. It used to be more of a bottom-up process. And the political centrifuge has thrown everybody out to the edges, and so there's not a real overlap in a lot of these things. So you used to govern on the middle, and you'd say, these guys on the left are a little bit crazy, but they have an interesting idea, and these guys on the right are a little bit crazy, and they have an interesting idea. And here in the middle, we're trying to make policy that actually works, and we can take a little from each side and put it together. And now you're sort of in a situation where even conversations between left and right, or Republican and Democrat, are very, very closely watched and, sort of self-regulated. Everybody's like, I don't want to get caught consorting with the enemy, even if the compromise is the policy we want.
I think in conjunction with sorting of the parties and the polarization you're talking about, you kind of glanced over social media, and this has been a little hobby horse of mine, but I'll take it, which is, the social media piece of that and its echoes or its consequences in mainstream media, your home for most of your life, has played a huge role in this, I think. Brian Harrison, for example, to take an example of somebody who's been a gadfly and, a willfully disruptive force, and I don't think he would disagree with that, frankly. We'll take mainstream media hits. He was on CNN during the quorum break, et cetera. But most of their time is spent just cultivating, for most of their media time, and sometimes just most of their time, is spent cultivating media followings and speaking more or less directly to those kind of, centrifugal edges of the party you're talking about.
Right.
That strike you as right? You were there as, at the Tribune as, the struggle for, are people going to read us, or are they just going to go straight to social media because it's more amenable to their frame, was happening, right?
Yeah, it's, I started long enough ago that it was, basically mainstream media was newspapers and TV stations, and to a great extent radio. And members got, sort of measure instant public sentiment from the size of the mail bags they were getting. They were actually mail bags, and you pulled them open and, you read all the stuff. And sometimes it was lobby generated or generated by an association or something.
Yeah.
And so all the letters were the, form letters or whatever. The difference was that if you got sent a mail bag, you could read through those letters, but everybody else wasn't reading through the letters that you got. Yeah. So you had all the same trolls and all the same kind of sentiment that you now see on social media, but it was not a public document in the way that social media is. So now, if you get a stream of trolls on any issue, or a stream of people jumping up and down one way or the other about an issue, it's not just that you can see it, it's that everybody else can see it.
Right.
And it's pretty easy to look at those things. I mean, we all do this to some extent. The stuff I saw seems to me to be the stuff everybody else is seeing. Whether that's actually true or not is the way you feel about it. And if you're in office and you think, well, everybody I hear from is saying X, Y, Z, you're going to tend to be very mindful of X, Y, Z when you operate. If you do that for a long time, in this case, 25 years, however long you want to call social media, 20 years, it gets embedded that's what you look at for, that's your thermometer, that's your gauge of what people are thinking, whether it is or not. It's the loudest part, whether or not it's the biggest part.
Well, there's also real-time self-aggrandizing measurement.
Right.
Right. In that, you get instant like, oh, wow, that
worked.
Yeah. I got 10,000 followers or 10,000 likes.
Yeah.
So you learn a new way of talking. And one of the things about the new way of talking is the sharper you are, the better it plays in social media, regardless of the feelings of the person you're talking to. So all the language that you used to use when you were disagreeing with somebody, my esteemed colleague, blah, blah, blah.
And now you can ask if Gene Wu is in China.
The SOB that I'm talking to, the language has changed and all of that. And there's no recognition of your opponent's place in the argument.
Well, and that's a really good transition to the next. I mean, I want to come back to the nationalism and the up-down, top-down, bottom-up thing a little later, but I want to stick with this a little bit because you kind of, if you've been watching the debates, especially in the last week, the language has changed not only in social media. I mean, it's
changed on the floor of the House.
Right. I mean, right. If you happen to watch the debate over the ivermectin bill in the House yesterday, I mean, there was this is not completely new, but there was an amendment that Rafael Anchia offered that was essentially a trolling amendment.
Right.
To rename the bill the Darwin bill because it was
the Darwin Awards bill. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And the language around that, by the time that debate was over, by the time I think Republicans understandably felt insulted, but if you think of the merits of the case, it was clear that amendment was about saying, hey, this is stupid and suicidal policy.
Right.
But they also, people were saying that exact phrase. But I mean, and she did say that it was something like stupid at the front mic. I mean, and so, it's the reinforcement, but that brings me to the
they've made sure every injury comes with an insult.
Yeah. Right? And vice versa. If
all
they're
of the
able.
fights that you were going to have anyway were there. You might win this bill, you might lose this bill, you might walk out with sore feelings because you really believed in it. All of that stuff has always been here. That's what the fighting box was built for. But the thing where you take the extra measure of, and when I get you down a little bit, I'm going to kick pretty hard.
Well, that's exactly what I want to do. Josh and I have been as we've been working on this intro class that we've been doing. And one of the concepts that we introduced kind of at the front end of the class was norms. Yeah. Right? Talking about changing norms. Right. And, we've seen a lot of that. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I mean. Is you'll sort of go back over the session, and there have been a couple different instances where people have kind of raised their head up and said, wait a minute, this is pretty weird. And so you start to think about, earlier in the session, we saw Patrick attempt sort of late at night to refuse to reduce to writing some of the comments that had taken place, which was pretty unusual, and it sort of had a pretty big, I'd say, maybe one of the, honestly, recently probably the biggest pushback from the Senate that, I can think of.
Yeah, because he got some.
Yeah, because
Well, but that's an institutional infraction, right? It's
Right.
like, wait a minute, you're not, you've always called these balls and strikes, and now you're calling them,
well, yeah, that's tricky.
Well, right.
And then, obviously there's the whole sort of financial and legal, if civil penalties on legislators by other legislators. There's the efforts by the executive branch to remove legislative branch members, which sort of just in a basic sense is kind of crazy. There's the denial of the filibuster that we talked about, right in a few days. And then there's this all sort of general open hostility, the reality of, future Democrat committee chairs and all this stuff. And it is like, you kind of look back over this session is like, is this when the dam breaks? And I'll just throw one other question out there since I'm going to keep my comments limited here. One of the things I'm thinking about as you guys are talking about this is I know that this is obviously part of a long trajectory. When you talk about the idea you can't even go to dinner with somebody because we were in a seat. I'm thinking about O'Rourke and Hurd going on that trip and putting on social media and people just being pissed about it, especially Hurd even doing it. That's how long back this has been going. This idea of this is a terrible idea. Two guys sitting together and talking. So this has been ongoing, but there's part of me that also wonders, just to your points, and you can bring it back. But one, how much of this do we have to caveat by the fact that we are in the second special session? Nobody wanted to be here as far as we can tell if we were asking this question in April. Nobody expected it necessarily or wanted that.
That's kind of a given for special sessions, right?
That's the thing. So that's already turning the temperature up. And then the other piece of it I was thinking about, you're talking about the top-down nature of it. And one of the things that strikes me as tricky here, and I think one of the things that makes this challenging for Texas is when somebody says, hey, there's this problem, there's this scourge that liberalism is inflicting on America. Well, this is still Texas, right? And so it's kind of like when you say the liberals are doing A, B, and C, you kind of in Texas, where are they doing that? You're kind of looking around because in some sense, in a different instance we can point to, it's sort of we end up with policies in search of problems. Sure. Increasingly. And I wonder how much that in and of itself also just filters into this in the sense that this isn't a bottom up, we have this problem here, we need to deal with it. So therefore, and then that leads to hurt feelings. This is everybody's going to deal with this, whether it's a problem or not. And now you're fighting this fight that honestly, I think a lot of people, at least, Democrats are looking and say, well, wait a minute, when was this a problem? So I just sort of I'm trying to caveat this a little bit in some ways and understanding how much of this is sort of short-term pressures and how much of this is long-term trajectory that doesn't change. Speaking of norms, right? Is the horse out of the barn? Is it just there are no more Democratic committee chairs? Is next session going to be awful, or is it going to revert back in some way?
It's the goals have changed a little bit. There are places where you say we're here to get a new policy in place. Mm-hmm. Kerrville had these floods. And we need to do some things to make sure that this doesn't happen this way again. We're going to have more floods, but let's prepare for it. We're actually dealing with policy. There's something that we need to address. We all know we need to address it. It doesn't matter what party you're in. A flood's a flood, and we've got to take care of this.
Right.
Or a few years ago, the freezes. Mm-hmm. We have to do something with the grid. We have to, all of these kinds of things. You still have those things where you come in and your job is to do policy and to do things. And the goal is clear to everybody, and those tend to be the places where they work together. Congress comes together every once in a while because we've got an external threat. We've got, war or something, and all of a sudden, oh, wow, that acts like Congress. Who knew they could do that? When they're not doing that, they're doing other things and they have other goals. And one of the goals that the parties both have at this point is to embarrass the other party and to shame the other party and to put them in a position where they look like a bunch of idiots. And so the fact that I've introduced a piece of legislation, whether or not it passes, put an asterisk there, I'll come back. Whether or not it passes, the argument favors me and shames my opponent. I could make that point about the various bills about trans people. If you're going to do a bathroom bill, and you're going to win or lose, and you really want this argument to proceed because it benefits your side and hurts the other side, losing the argument isn't such a bad thing because it prolongs the argument. And if I prolong the argument, I'm going to prolong the pain to my opponent, and I'm going to prolong the benefit to my guys. So you get all these cultural issues kind of wound up in this. And you have, I think you have to look at a lot of things that are introduced in the legislature, not just now, but, they seem to be more acceptable institutionally right now to introduce things that put my opponent in a bad position and really don't have beans to do with real public problems or real public policy.
But it's that acceptability that I wanted to ask you
Yeah.
about, right? I mean,
Right.
that's really the heart of the question is, you could probably come up with examples of that, communication/agenda management strategy
Right.
in the past, right?
Sure.
I mean, but I guess,
Sure, this was what all the, we went 20 years on tort reform.
right.
And one of the underlying arguments in tort reform was the people who were being sued were the people who financed one party, and the people who were suing were the people who financed the other party. And that was a long discussion. The trial lawyers were with the Democrats and the business people are with the Republicans. It wasn't a clean, 100% either way, but it was enough of one where you were sort of watching this thing that looked like a business fight was also a political proxy fight.
Yeah.
Right. Now you have things that really don't have that veneer of policy in front of them, right? They've just got, this is just a fight. We're going to have this fight. If I want to start, and, one that's been around for 100 years, or more, you want to have another book ban fight? We can do that. And, both of us in our way will benefit from this argument in a way that has nothing to do with public policy. The public policy and the legislative rooms that we're in are really just the forum for a culture fight that benefits us with our bases.
I wonder, if that is also, I've been wondering if that part of that, though, is also, the function of the fact that because of Trump's ascendance to the office, what we've seen, at least in polling, is, Republicans are less concerned about the border. And they're less focused on immigration, thinking, basically with the assessment that Trump is doing a better job of handling that issue. And one of the things that does is it takes what has been the perennial number one issue among Republicans. You can hang all kinds of issues to, right, around education, around healthcare, around provision of social services. And you could put that on immigration and sort of really just make a nice package that speaks to most of your voters. And then once you pull that away, you are searching for other things, right? You're searching for these other avenues to go and find and motivate people into it. But also it's kind of like, it gets a little crazy. Just to say, one of the things I was thinking, having watched this for a little while now, it used to be you'd say, well, there's only so many hot button issues they can really hit and get their business done.
I would change the emphasis. There are so many.
Well, now you're like, now there are so many hot, and that's the thing.
Right.
But it used to be, you would say at least 10 years ago, but, well, they don't want to do all these things, but they're gonna have fights over a couple of them.
There've always been a couple.
Yeah,
there've always been.
But now it feels like there is no limit.
Well, and it's sort of the dominant. Go back to what Jim was saying about social media. What makes this engine run?
Yeah,
is argument and conflict, and if it's got a little prurient edge to it, that's great. And right. if we can get this thing into an argument where we've turned the politics from a mix of sort of a logical approach to problems along with the emotional reaction to those problems, if we can turn this into a strictly emotional thing and make it an emotional argument, which cultural issues tend to do.
Yeah.
I can just make it a food fight, and food fights work great on social media, and politicians respond to what to perceived public opinion. And now we're back to everybody's reading the same mailbag, and they're looking at it and going, well, we probably should have a fight about book bans, or we should probably have a fight about trans athletes, because everybody, quote unquote, is talking about it.
Yeah, I think that was a really good point there. I never thought about that notion of, it's one thing to get, however many mailbags you get on this issue that you may or may not have addressed. It's another thing for everybody to look at your mail and see the receipts. And it does sort of speak to, we've been talking about the extent to which, at least in my perspective, part of what Abbott is able to do by setting the special session agenda is to inoculate himself from any sort of criticism that he hasn't dealt with a given issue. Whether or not the legislature deals with it, he can't, that's not necessarily his problem. He can say, hey, I put it on the special session. They either, they did or they didn't. But part of that is, it makes a lot more sense to think, why are we talking about ivermectin? It's like, well, because if enough people got on that, got out there and sort of made a point of it, that's basically now enough to say, let's make sure we address this for the people.
Right, and wind it back. If you have watched this a little bit and you're in this business, you begin to understand how to kind of stampede the horses. And how do I get ivermectin even into the argument? Right. Well, and now we're back to top-down national politics. It's
well,
I start this conversation, and if I can get it going, then the argument is going to benefit us, and I started the issue in the first place, so I don't have to argue about all the other issues that I didn't start that they started.
Well, to go back to my original question, and Josh sort of offered his answer to it,
sorry.
but I think that I guess the question I have is, are all the things you guys are suggesting are part of this? Some short-term, intermediate things, polarization, signaling from the top, individual incentives, this. But I guess my question is that it used to be, I think, that there was some internal regulatory mechanisms, part of which were historical practice and norm-based, maybe, to my mind, where the strategy was for the leadership to throttle that stuff, right? In other words, you and I have talked a lot where, okay, so what we're going to do, it's time to send all the abortion bills to state affairs, have a couple of hairy hearings, and then we're not going to hear about them anymore.
Right.
Right. I mean, and I don't want to overgeneralize that, but that was kind of a Laney approach that even kind of bled into the early Craddock days, I think, and could even arguably be said to characterize kind of the Strauss approach in the House.
There's always an issue. I mean, even now, there's always an issue where management, whoever is in charge, says, we're going to do that later. So let's give it enough of a pass that everybody can say we didn't ignore it, but we're not going to pass that this time.
Right. And so my question about that is then, and I don't know if this is cause or effect in terms of this norms discussion, is that balance seems to have shifted.
Yeah.
Right. I think, there's a lot more, we're just going to, at least in the House, this is just going to come to the floor.
Right.
And in some ways, the thing that used to often strike me as just a line has actually become a little more true in that, we're going to bring it to the floor and the body's going to decide.
Right.
Now, I don't want to seem like a rube. I know that's not necessarily but it does seem to me like the shift in that balance between the share of the kind of issues we gotta do, or we all agree on, or we recognize, as a policy matter we're going to get, and the other stuff that you guys are kind of raising in terms of the political benefits of whether it's ivermectin or abortion or trans bill, whatever,
right.
That all of that seems to have shifted, and it does seem like the expectations around that are shifting, right? That you've got a core of people in both bodies, right now largely in the majority party, but there's probably a Democratic correlate to this in the minority, if I could think about it, that aren't willing to accept the earlier practices and the norms around them, saying, hey, look, this is a body, you're in a party where some members, this is a very hard vote for, and so you're not always going to get those bills. I mean, that was kind of the underlying reasoning. And it just seems to me that maybe I'm making the norms thing more complicated. Maybe it's just polarization and more homogenous parties and the accretion of one party being in charge for a long time.
Right.
But I still think that if you take those as the primary explanations, you've created a reinforcing dynamic in which you've got, an increasing number of members whose institutional memory is not of this previous balance between policy and ideology or policy and social issues. It's more just what's happened the last few years, and there has been a lot of turnover.
You've got a change in goals too. So, at one time the norm was, if I'm a presiding officer, if I'm the lieutenant governor or the speaker, part of my job is to protect the people in the House or the Senate, protect the body, right?
Right.
So I'm going to do this in a way that abortion was a great example. When Bill Hobby was the lieutenant governor and Billy Clayton and Gib Lewis were the speakers in succession, most of the Republicans, who were a very small minority at the beginning of that era, most of the Republicans didn't want to vote on abortion either. And so, they were mostly, moderate Republicans or liberal Republicans, whatever you want to call them. And the Democrats didn't want to vote on it. So the idea was, okay, look, there is a loud group of voters who want this to be on the agenda, and we're going to acknowledge this as an item that's on the agenda. But we're also, because nobody wants to vote on it.
But you can't make me.
Well, none of the members really wanted to vote on it, and they didn't want to, the vote was going to be divisive, which is fine if you really, really believe in the thing. but also it's going to mark everybody. And once you're marked, then we're going to have this political races, and our political races are just going to be about this one issue, which would be great if we thought it was the main issue, right? And so we're just going to park that. And we're going to spend our time doing whatever else we're doing. We're going to do tort reform, or we're going to do brucellosis was a special session item at one time. Whatever the heck it is. And the idea is that the members are protected. They'll keep voting for the speaker. They'll keep responding to the lieutenant governor. Every once in a while, you'll get something divisive. So we had the famous killer bees thing when Bill Hobby wanted to get a bill that was about election law. The Democrats didn't like it. Enough of them decamped to stop consideration of it. And finally, Hobby came around.
And for the youngins out there, as a reminder, Bill Hobby was a Democrat.
Yeah, Bill Hobby was a Democrat. And so they did a quorum bust. I mean, they've done quorum busts all the way through history. They did them in Congress. Abraham Lincoln went out the window of Congress one time to deny them a quorum. This has been around for a while. It wasn't a regular tool. It's become kind of a regular tool. Yeah. But all of these things were in place. And, you had all of these things where every once in a while somebody would do something extraordinary, and there was always a little bit of an institutional bruise after it was done. And everybody would say, that was, I understand why you did that and it worked, but, let's don't make that a regular thing, because that's kind of an awful way to do business, right? As you get into a political era where those kinds of issues that are very appealing to a loud minority in one party or the other convinces the people at the top of that party that they have to respond. And maybe those people are speakers and maybe those people are lieutenant governors, then they put them on the agenda and they put them up for full consideration. And the shift changes from, I'm going to protect the members so that this is an operating body and we have comity and all of that kind of stuff, into a place where this is a place that reflects the, sometimes nasty politics of what's going on outside. And so the argument that happens out in the idea marketplace, which right now some people regard social media as, is going to play out inside the legislative halls, and it's going to be just as nasty as it is online.
Well, and I think, that's where you have to put more homogenous parties in, right? Even in a couple of your examples, where you're saying, we're not going to push abortion bills because, a lot of the Republicans actually don't,
Right.
But a lot of those Republicans have been replaced. I mean, that's part
of
it.
Exactly. Well, but that was at the time, right? No, that's what I'm saying.
No, I'm not thinking how we got to here.
This is when the party's Venn diagram overlapped significantly, and now
they don't.
It does a little, but
on some issues, but not on a lot. But the point is, I think, in a lot of ways, on the social issues, is to find those issues where they don't.
Right. Right. Because, and that goes back to what I was saying. The fight is more important than the result. The fact that we're fighting. And then you get into things that are, straight up politics that have always been this way, like redistricting.
Well, that's where I wanted to go next. It's perfect because, in some ways, this redistricting fight looks very familiar, but in other ways not, right? I think.
Redistricting
what do you think?
Redistricting is always, I'm going to eat as much cake as I can, and you're going to try to stop me and eat as much cake as you can. And that's kind of how this goes. And we used to have stronger legal constraints and court-ordered restraints on how much cake you could take and how you could take cake.
Right.
Keep this weird analogy going on.
Please.
I like cake.
So, there was a strong correlation in places like Texas between the voting patterns of blacks and Hispanics. They had a high correlation to Democrats and Republicans. Blacks were 80 or 90% Democratic votes, and Hispanics were 60 to 70%, depending on where you were, Democratic votes. And so if you were drawing a map and you were constrained by civil rights laws, you could hide your partisan workings under the guise of civil rights. We're drawing these districts so that these voters or these voters or these voters have a right to express their opinions and have a reasonable chance of getting somebody who represents their views into Congress or the legislature or the county commissioner's court or whatever the heck it is. And as those civil rights protections have being peeled away by the Supreme Court largely, and the Supreme Court's decision that partisan fights in redistricting cannot be justiciable, I think is the word they use. It became okay to just say, no, actually, this isn't based on race or anything at all. This is just based on we Republicans or we Democrats getting as much votes as we can.
It's like, oh, there's more cake.
There's more cake.
There's more cake.
So California has 47 seats in Congress, and 7 of them are Republican. And Texas has 38 seats in Congress, and 13 are Democratic. And that's disproportionate to the votes statewide in either state. So in Texas, Democrats generally get 40 to 43% of the vote. And in the maps that just got approved and that Abbott's, about to sign, they would have 21% of the seats in the congressional delegation. It's not representative, but it's legal.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
and it'll be more comparable to what it looks like in some of the other states that are gerrymandered in either direction. To be
which is
clear.
kind of the Republican defense.
And what generally happens, sort of the textbook argument here is, wait a minute, this doesn't represent the people who are the voters. You're not taking care of the voters. You're taking care of the parties, and you're doing it on behalf of the politicians who happen to be incumbents right now, and who regard their incumbencies as properties of their parties that should be passed from one member to another. So when this one ages out, I get another person from the same party. That's not exactly what anybody had in mind at the beginning, but we've left all of that behind. Redistricting is always about taking as much as you can get. And as these constraints have fallen away, the parties have been able to get more and more.
What's interesting about it is you put it that way, when you phrase it that way, one of the recent exceptions that I think was, fairly widely noticed was that the 2021 redistricting here was not take as much as you can get as it usually is.
Yeah.
Right.
On a partisan basis, right?
Right.
And, in some ways that's maybe, there are a lot of more proximate causes, but it's also one of the reasons it hasn't held politically.
But it's also disproportionate to the statewide vote.
Yeah, well.
The congressional congressional districting is more Republican than the state electorate.
Yeah.
Right. Legislative's pretty even.
Well,
And it's a little bit more, but it's not like an outlier.
Well, and interesting to the point you're making, and I think it's also regardless of the legal landscape, just thinking about the future political landscape, it's making the distribution of the racial demographics of the state increasingly disproportionate in the congressional districts, right? So, if most of the population growth in the state over the last 2 decades was driven by non-white population, by no, something like 90+%, the last round of redistricting increased the share of congressional districts that were majority white. This next round of redistricting, or this current round of redistricting, is going to increase that further. And there is sort of again, this is sort of kind of this moment where, what race and ethnicity means in the context of politics, the law, everything else is very much, a kind of on the tip of things. But it is interesting to think, just from a representational standpoint, if race is a big part of this or not, that the state is becoming less representative in that, even if it is becoming more or less, I guess, representative.
Well, an interesting thing that occurred to me as you were in your phrasing of how you recounted, kind of the height of the civil rights influence on redistricting is this idea that, and I'm going to put words in your mouth a little bit, so feel free.
I'll fight back. Go ahead.
I think it's just, it seems like, you were kind of like, look, when the Democrats drew maps, they drew them to their advantage, with the very available and reasonably legitimate cover of saying, this is because we are the party of ensuring representation. I'm using this out of historical context, to people of color, to our constituents of color.
Right.
And that was kind of, and almost in a sense, the implication was, race became kind of the mask for partisanship.
Right.
Right.
In a very explicit way.
Right.
And then when you listen to the recent discussions and the way that has now been inverted rhetorically by Republicans, it's a very interesting contrast, which is, no, we're not thinking about race at all.
Right.
And we're going to go to absurd heights to go, I don't even know that there were people of different colors in those districts when we drew those maps.
Sort of the John Roberts idea of we're past that. We're post,
exactly. Even though, look, that's.
But both sides, but now go back to
it's an interesting historical inversion, right? Or refiguration of how we talk about race that I think is indicative of things you and I have been talking about and that are clearly out there in which the rhetoric of how we've talked about race is we're in like the post-civil rights movement era.
Or
right?
in a re-civil rights movement. I mean, this is also, to go back to what we were talking about with cultural fights, this is an argument both parties kind of want to have.
Do you think?
Well, I do. I think that the idea of, what the country is becoming demographically, the Democrats and Republicans either want to consider it and use it, depending on their situation, to their own political advantage. And I think a lot of politics. Obviously, redistricting is all about politics, and I think that if, to the extent that this underlies it, they want to have the cultural fight about it.
To your skepticism about whether they want to have it or not, I mean, I think one of the advantages the Republicans have right now in this fight is that they're pretty unified. They realize pretty clearly, both legally and culturally, that the cultural moment is good for them to make the kind of argument that they're making, which is explicitly, we're not talking about race at all, but implicitly, but the Democrats have the problem in that some Democrats really want to have this fight, but others are kind of saying, we've been losing these fights. How do we keep our commitments, but inch away from, I shouldn't even say inch away, but, turn it down from, 10 to 6 or 7.
Right.
In some ways, at least a faction of the party is, all the talk about like, well, we're listening to the groups too much.
Well, I would say it's not even about, I think your word, it's not even about turning it down. It's about reconfiguring it. And the thing that the Democrats haven't figured out how to do is reconfigure, a lot of language and politics around groups and around race that was formed both around, African Americans in particular, and legal fights and legal rights that were extended to African Americans in particular based on their unique experience in this country. But now you're looking at a population, especially in Texas, that's shifting so much demographically. The fastest growing, demographic group in the country is mixed race. When you're talking to Hispanic people who, first of all, pan-ethnic identifier who are coming from many different countries, many different generations in the U.S., living in different parts of the country with different political profiles, just taking sort of the rhetoric that was used to sort of talk about group consciousness in African Americans is clearly not working right now, or at the very least it's created an opening. And Republicans have walked right into it and are very happy to say, hey, we don't see color. This is the new America. We're just looking for, who best and the brightest right now. Now look, anybody who's read this history, whatever, knows sort of the nature of colorblind and how that sort of stuff is used. But the thing is you sort of look at the last 5 or 6 years or more, you say you had Black Lives Matter, you had sort of a DEI push, and we're very much in a backlash to that right now. And that's where the emphasis and the momentum is. And while Republicans are, I think, very comfortable walking forward into that, and they've been shown they are, I don't think Democrats know what the hell they're doing with themselves right now. Right now,
the Republicans have the Democrats split on the issue.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's why I'm a little bit, I don't know if they both want to have that fight. I mean, I think Democrats are hopeful.
Well, I guess I should say the Republicans want to have the fight and some of the Democrats do.
Yeah, and I think the Democrats are hopeful in the abstract that there's a backlash to the backlash. That at some point, there is a sort of like nobody asked for this and you're going like above and beyond what anybody said. And so now, but the other side of it is I don't think Democrats know how to talk about this. We talk about this all the time, but if you say well, let's talk about racial and ethnic minorities in Texas. It's like, well, who are we talking about?
Right.
It's kind of like, and not to say that historically that doesn't have real concrete meaning. 100% it does. But in the politics of the moment, that meaning may not apply to most people who are just, coming to these issues.
Well, and not to sound, like somebody out of time, I guess, but what's lurking underneath that partially is that, well, we use the term backlash all the time and I'm not saying it's not the right, but I mean, I think there's something when we talk about backlash that sometimes has this connotation that it's a little bit ephemeral, like we're just going to wait for the backlash to pass and then things will swing back. And I think the key thing to remember about this is that the backlash to civil rights is really tapping into something that never went away.
Right.
Since Reconstruction. Right. In other words, this resistance to this, to, whatever term you want to use, the idea of a multiracial democracy, civil rights enforcement, plural, whatever there has been resistance to that from the moment the Civil War ended.
Yeah, right.
Right? And it never really went away.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that is, interesting, to use a too academic and too neutral term, about watching this unfold, is the degree to which, the basic precepts never really kind of went away.
This is never over.
Right. And
so far anyway.
And so this is really a reassertion and a kind of, that's why I was kind of, struggling with a kind of post-civil rights era terminology, something like that. But we're definitely in a resurgence of something that's always been brewing and, fueled the chipping away of civil rights stuff, civil rights achievements or civil rights legislation and civil rights jurisprudence, almost from the moment it existed.
Yeah.
Right. And so I want to, so we don't go on for too much longer. One more thing before we go back and tie this together, I think, with the thing that ties a lot of it together, which is the nationalization discussion. But something I'm interested in talking to you about, Ross, and we talked about this intermittently, and that's the argument that one factor, and it's actually even raised its head a little bit in this discussion we've already had, is the increase in the gravity of the executive branch, and in particular the governor's office in the state political system over at least certainly the last couple of governorships.
Right.
But certainly, I think in a very, very conscious way with Greg Abbott. Does that read make sense to you? Do you think it's permanent? I always say when we went back, and we probably talked about this at the time, when Perry handed off the governorship to Abbott, one of the big discussions was, Perry's kind of built this thing up. Is Abbott going to be able to maintain it or not? And I think we have to my mind, we have a pretty clear answer to that now.
Well, I think you're right to pin it on both of them. Perry started this thing early on where he began the process of, I'm not only appointing people to run these executive agencies, I'm appointing people who will report back. And over time, because he was in office for 14 years, he was able to not only increase his influence and communication with those boards, but also with their top executives. So after Perry had been in office, somewhere toward the end of his, first 8 years or so, you could see that almost all of the executive agencies, the executive director, probably the general counsel, certainly the communications office, were all former Perry employees. They'd actually worked in the governor's office. And they were, and this network went out and they were very methodical about this. And they had looked at, some predecessors. Bob Bullock, when he was controller for 16 years, had placed people all over state government because it was an office that spun off a lot of experts. And, my agency needs a budget expert. Well, where do I go for that? I go to the controller's office. So one of Bullock's people is in my shop now. And, people who really study government, who are in the practice of it, were looking at this and going, this is very, very clever. And two of them were Rick Perry and Rick Williamson, who worked with Rick Perry a lot. Yeah. They'd been House members together. And so they began to do this to the governor's office. And so they had this, they spread their tentacles. And, it went to boards of regents at universities. It went to the boards that oversee big departments like highways and health and parks and wildlife and all of those kinds of things. So they kind of set that groundwork in place. And this is what Greg Abbott inherited. He was attorney general during this whole time, watching this and from time to time blessing it and certainly defending it wherever it got, challenged. So he was familiar with the thing and familiar with the argument and, the idea of Texas constitutionally has a weak governor and the party that's in control now has some tendencies toward liking unitary executives. The person in charge is the person in charge. So what else could you do? Well, what if the agencies had to go through the governor's office to get their administrative rules approved? Whenever you pass a big piece of legislation, particularly something like a tax bill, you got to write a bunch of administrative law to say, okay, here's how we're going to administer this tax. And all these minor arguments about, the bill says this, that means you could tax X or not tax X. What
There's
are you
a
going to do?
rulemaking process.
It's all rules. Yeah. And, it's very, very, it's where a lot of the power in the executive branch is. taxes, environmental controls, all of that stuff, all the regulations. So what if all of that had to go through the governor's office? Well, voila, now it does. What if, they all reported back and it became more of a thing where the governor actually is the CEO and not just somebody who has all of these fiefdoms.
Yeah.
I name these people and then they go off and do whatever they do. We're not going to do that anymore. I'm going to get blamed when the state freezes over and the power goes off. So I'm going to have some direct control, damn it, over the Public Utility Commission and ERCOT, right? I mean, you get those kinds of things. Greg Abbott's consolidated that power to a terrific extent. One of the things we're watching in Washington is Trump doing, with a strong office, something like the same thing to try to make it even stronger. And some of one of the things that I think is fascinating about this that they're doing that's similar is, there's sort of a body of folklore that says you can't do that, you're a weak governor, or the president can't do that. Right. And, Abbott quietly and Trump loudly have come in and said, what if I do? What are you going to do about it?
You know what that sounds like to me? A change in norms.
Well, that's a change. Well, yeah, but it's a thing where you say, I'm going to do this, and if they stop me, okay, but I'm going to try it. I'm going to push the envelope. I'm going to push. I'm going to test all the fences, and it turns out that a lot of those fences are pretty weak, and you can go through them, and nobody says anything, and by the time they do say something, you say, well, I've been doing this for years. I've been at it for a long time.
Or you've moved on to some other
moved on to something
area.
else. Or, this is politics, and everybody's a temp. Right? I mean, we don't live forever. And you get the thing where you say, well, it worked while I had it. And, during the 10 years I was in office or the 14 years or however long these guys are in office, it worked while I had it is all really that you wanted, because that's how I wanted to work it. And if they change it later, they change it later. That's the next guy's problem.
So it seems like, what we're talking about here is some level is a story of, individual political entrepreneurs stretching both institutional rules and norms and then it feeding back onto the institutions theoretically, right? So that's my question is, or the next question, the obvious one is, so Abbott eventually leaves office,
right?
Presumably. And
death is undefeated.
And are you watching Alien Earth, my friend?
Not yet, but I will.
Does it last? Right. I mean, in other words, because my feeling is it's almost like it's the opposite of coastal erosion. I mean, it depends on what the object is, but it just seems like, there are fluctuations, but this is where the pendulum is kind of misleading to me. It feels to me more like,
it's like
you
a glacier.
You step forward and then maybe the next person isn't quite as strategic, able to take advantage. The legislature develops more of a spine and pushes back. You get divided, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Whatever the thing is, but it feels to me like Abbott and Perry have done enough that I don't expect too much receding beyond the variable of how good are you at, occupying the office.
And the real way that it would recede, whether at the national level or here, would be if the legislature says, hey, wait a minute, we don't like this. I mean, part of this is a reflection of all the stuff that we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at sort of the willingness of either Trump or Abbott to sort of take the space that's given to them, and you say, well, where was that space given? A lot of the times it was given by the legislatures because they say, hey, you make the rules.
There's a lot of stuff in the state budget that Abbott has decided to interpret in a particular way that used to be completely legislatively control of the executive branch. They would write a rider into the budget and say, thou shalt not. And Abbott's taken the position that, I can veto riders and, all of those kinds of things. And, it's a question of what can I get away with? How much can I do without the judiciary, one of the other branches of government, stepping in and saying, stop there.
Yeah.
And then, everybody's going to be in a position, every governor is going to be in a position where he or she is going to be doing things and somebody's going to say, you can't do that. And they're going to go, wait a minute, why not? Right? And how do we get around that? And they're going to pull in their lawyers and everything and say, how do we get around that? I want to get done what I want to get done. And, to your ocean analogy, this is erosion. And, when you basically Abbott is establishing a new fence line. And it may be that the next governor or the governor after that doesn't go all the way to that fence line, but goes way past where the fence line was when Perry was governor or when Bush was governor or when Richards was governor. It's, we've got a stronger governor state in place today than we did 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people would probably look at that, in both parties and say, it is an executive position. And this is the executive part of the state, and we did elect them to run the thing, and we're going to blame them for everything that goes wrong. So what's the problem? And then the question is, okay, what would be the legislature's basis for taking it back? And I think the only way the legislature takes any of this back, or the courts take any of this back, is if a governor goes so far that they go, that's not going to be allowed. But I don't think that they get all the little things in the process. I think they'll slap down and say, you can't do that. It's like, okay, that's a solid fence now.
Well, that's a great transition to the final, just to return to the national influences thing. Because as of now, the national example we're looking at suggests that counting on the other branches to say, hey, that's too far. Our expectations, I think, have been kind of frustrated. A lot of people's expectations anyway. I'll just say my expectations have been kind of frustrated by that, in which we've seen the executive in this presidential term in particular push those boundaries, and people kind of go, yeah.
It's clear that in the Congress, the calculus is not in political interest to try to push back on any of that,
Right.
so long as it's not. Right. I mean, the question is does the calculus is it possible for that calculus to ever flip? And I think it's unlikely that calculus is going to flip anytime soon in this current configuration. I keep going back to this point because I think it is kind of worth remembering just about and I know that it goes beyond this, but one of the things that I recall about, Roberts being made the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court when he was nominated, and one of the big benefits to the Bush administration in nominating him at that point in time was the fact that he was known for having such an expansive view of executive power.
Yeah.
That he had a history of having this, sort of expansive view of executive power. Post 9/11, this was seen as a great asset, and ultimately, in some ways, I guess I'm, comforted by the consistency of it. In some ways, you're looking at it, yeah, that's what they said.
They said it right there on the contents of the box.
Yeah,
right?
they said it when they put him up there. And I mean, who knew that this was going to be sort of where this was going to go? But ultimately, I'll say, we've been talking a lot about the Constitution. We've been looking, you look at history. I mean, the executive branches were not meant to be these powerful branches, but ultimately the practice that has developed has been one in which the legislatures have generally sort of said, yeah, go do that. Go handle that, because we can't.
You're better geared for this.
You're better geared for this. And honestly, we're incapable of working out these kinds of details anyway. We can barely pass big legislation to begin with. So the idea that we're gonna hammer out even the minor details is so beyond.
But what I would say is that the scope of those areas where legislatures and the other branches are ceding authority is expanding.
Yeah.
And has expanded a lot. And I guess, again, to the theme of the podcast and to get close to the end, you think this is permanent?
No. And I think one of the things that we talked about earlier, the reason the administration wants the states to redistrict is because they don't want the Congress to flip, because Congress would then become a counterweight.
Yeah.
It's a Republican Congress right now. And if it becomes a Democratic Congress, then now you're running an obstacle course where you used to have free and clear. And so the threat of the kind of check on this is why they're fighting so hard, why the Trump administration is coming to places like Texas and saying, hey, give me 5 more seats. Hey, give me 3 more seats. Give me, get me past this thing so that I can continue to run unfettered.
I like that.
And I think as soon as they're, the fetters are there. The fetters are written into the rules. And eventually it comes around. And eventually you do something. I mean, I do believe this about the pendulum. Eventually somebody takes it too far. You go a little bit, well, he got away with that. I can go a little further than that. I can go a little further than that. Finally, somebody says, wait a minute. And it always comes around.
Yeah, I suspect that'll happen literally the time that the partisanship in the White House changes hands.
Well, I think
just to say it out loud. I mean, it's not going to be that far.
If I'm a Republican and I'm in a position of power and I want Donald Trump to have all of the power he could possibly have, I think the quote this week was, "I'm the president of the United States. I can do anything I want." If you want that kind of thing for your guy, then you have to be ready for their guy to have that kind of power. And, you know how that goes. Everybody, oh my God, we can't give that kind of stuff to
Yeah,
this,
but we
Yahoo.
also know that hypocrisy means nothing.
Right.
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 We also know local control doesn't matter, and all these things that we've seen where it's like, yeah, that's
Right.
true. And I mean, and again, I think, and then you pointed this out. I mean, I was sort of mentioning the courts. I mean, the way that the shadow docket is or is not sort of more or less amenable to who's doing what with this newfound power is kind of going to be something that's going to play out over time.
Right. How can we use the tools that are available today to do the things that we want to do now?
Right.
Is how all of this stuff runs.
And
how can I impede the people I oppose from following the first line?
Well,
right?
and having, when you have more unified parties and they're more, they're, again, broken record, but they're more homogenous, there's less of an internal check on that.
Right.
In terms of just heading in one direction. I want to end, Ross, by saying, okay, so that was all sort of the national thing where, look, we could see this actually changing very quickly if the Democrats retake the House. It's the whole logic of the redistricting. I think all that is right. But the terrain is different in Texas. I mean, I think, whatever happens with the redistricting, we know that the House is closely divided at the national level. Pattern so far has been more alternation, et cetera, all of that. That's not the pattern here.
Right.
So does this move in a much more executive-centric direction continue here as well? Or, like you were very quick to say, no, I don't think it lasts when I asked.
Right.
Does that apply to Texas too? Is my question for you.
Yeah, I think, things work as long as they work. And then and then somebody comes in and changes them. And, it's usually something that is big and has public attention, that brings public attention to government in a way that it's not usually focused on government. I don't know what those guys are doing in Austin. I don't care what those guys in Austin are doing. Wait a minute. I want to know what those guys in Austin are doing, right? When you get a moment like that and people say, something bad is going on, the people in charge need to be replaced and with something completely different. Those are those moments. You also have, a state full of political entrepreneurs and people who are looking at this and going, I could run today. I want to run for office. I don't like the thing that they're doing with X, whatever it is. I would do education different, whatever it is. And I would do it differently, and I feel strongly about it. And I have some resources, and I can either do this within the parties or without. And if both of the parties are falling in favor and I could attract some attention, I'm going to go with that. And those kinds of people show up, consistently in our history. And, sometimes they're not the winners, but they change the argument. And I'm confident that that'll happen. There are enough things, right now Greg Abbott's doing well because there are enough things going well in the state that people are, on average, okay with it. But it may be that, being 43rd in education isn't good enough. And somebody comes around and says, we actually need to do something about that in a compelling way and gets people fired up about it. And all of a sudden you have a big, election that's about education, or you have a big election that's about, how come the state's not taking better care of us in freezes and floods, or all of those kinds of things. Somebody will jump up because somebody always does. And I don't know what the issue will be. It may be that when we run the 26 elections, it's about the economy. I mean, a year from now, who knows what we're going to be talking about? It may be about, we don't like the way immigration has gone in the last 12 months. But I do think that the sort of the fundamental competition in politics and the fundamental fight over where we're going has always been an engine of change, and I think it'll persist.
I guess my question to that would be, but it seems right now it's more likely to go in a more authoritative direction than a less authoritative direction.
That's where the momentum is right now. I mean, will it change? Yeah, you didn't ask me for time period.
Yeah, no, I realized that was a flaw in the question after I asked. So, Ross, as always, a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thanks for calling
Josh,
me out of the deeper
hope
time.
you had fun. Thank you for joining.
Yeah.
Thanks to our excellent production crew here in the audio studio in Liberal Arts Instructional Technology Services at the University of Texas at Austin. And thanks to all of you for listening. Not a ton of data came up today, but You'll be able to find supplemental things that are supplemental to the podcast, lots of other goodies at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. So thank you all for listening. And we should be back next week, I think, with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.